The sun over Redemption, Arizona, was a merciless hammer beating the dust of the main street into a fine, shimmering powder. It was 1875, a time when progress was measured in miles of steel rail, and civilization was a flimsy coat of paint on a saloon front. For Jedediah, Jed Stone's civilization was the rhythmic clang of his own hammer on hot iron, a sound that drowned out the ghosts that whispered in the quieter moments. The sign above his smithy, its letters faded by the relentless glare, read simply, J. Stone Blacksmith. It was a lie of omission. It should have read, J. Stone, former U.S. Marshal, a man trying to forge a life from the ashes of another. Jed's arms, corded with muscle from a lifetime of work, swung the hammer in a familiar arc. The steel glowed a furious orange, surrendering its shape to his will. Sweat beaded on his brow, tracing paths through the soot on his face. He was a broad-shouldered man, with a face weathered like an old cliffside and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He had come to Redemption 3 years ago, seeking not redemption, but anonymity. He'd sought a place where the name Jedediah Stone didn't carry the weight of a dozen graves, a place where the only thing he had to kill was time. The heat in the forge was a physical presence, a dry, suffocating force. But Jed welcomed it. It burned away the memories, or at least muted them. The memory of his wife Sarah, her smile as bright as a prairie sunrise. The memory of his daughter Lily, her laughter like the chiming of a tiny bell. The memories were all he had left, and they were a curse. They lived inside a small silver locket. He never wore a sacred thing he kept locked away, as if distance could somehow lessen the ache. A sudden commotion from the street broke his rhythm. Shouts, a woman's scream, the panicked whinny of a horse. Jed set his hammer down his body, tensing with an instinct he had tried for years to bury. He wiped the sweat from his eyes and stepped to the wide-open door of the smithy, peering into the blinding sunlight. Down the street in front of the Redemption Bank and Trust, chaos had erupted. 3 masked men stood with rifles leveled, their horses held by a fourth. A 5th man, tall and dressed in a fine black coat that seemed to mock the oppressive heat, stood on the bank's porch as if he owned it. He moved with an unnerving grace. His face uncovered a charismatic smile playing on his lips, even as his men herded terrified townsfolk against a wall. This was not the work of common road agents. This was precise, cold, and theatrical. Jed's hand instinctively twitched, reaching for a holster that was no longer there. His gaze fell on the town's sheriff, Augustus Miller, emerging from his office. Gus was an old man, his hair white as cotton, his movements slowed by age, but not by fear. He and Jed shared a quiet friendship built on stories never fully told, and a mutual understanding of the violence men were capable of. Gus held a shotgun, but his face was grim. He knew he was outmatched. "This is far enough." Blackwood Gus's voice was a gravelly roar, a lion's last challenge. "There's no need for bloodshed in this town." The man in the black coat, Silas Blackwood, turned his head slowly. His smile widened, a chilling expression that held no warmth. "Sheriff Miller." He called out, his voice smooth and clear, carrying easily in the sudden silence. "I do so admire your courage. It is a rare and beautiful thing. And like all beautiful things, it is destined to be broken." Silas raised a silver-plated pistol, its polished surface catching the sun like a shard of broken mirror. The shot was deafening. Jed watched, frozen in a horrifying tableau, as Gus staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. The shotgun clattered to the dust. The old sheriff fell, his eyes wide with a final silent surprise. A collective gasp swept through the onlookers. The robbery was no longer about money. It had become a public execution. Jed's breath caught in his throat, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. He had seen countless men die, but this was different. This was Gus. This was his friend murdered for nothing more than doing his duty in a town Jed had chosen for its peace. Silas Blackwood holstered his pistol with a flourish. He paid no mind to the body in the dust. Instead, he strolled into the sheriff's office. Jed's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. Why the sheriff's office? The bank was next door. The money was there. A few moments later, Silas emerged holding a canvas sack that was clearly not full of gold. He tossed it to one of his men, but something else was in his other hand. Something small and silver glinting in the sun. Jed's blood ran cold. He knew that glint. He knew its shape, its weight, its terrible, precious meaning. It was the locket. He had left it in Gus's safe for safekeeping, unable to bear, having it in his own house, yet terrified of losing it. It was the only tangible piece of Sarah and Lily he had left. Inside were their miniature portraits, painted with an artist's loving hand, Sarah's kind eyes, Lily's innocent smile. Silas Blackwood paused, holding the locket up to the light. He opened it, his head tilted, as if admiring a fine work of art. Then he looked up, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the townspeople, until it found Jed standing in the dark doorway of the smithy. Silas's smile returned this time, filled with a knowing personal cruelty. He snapped the locket shut and slipped it into his coat pocket. It wasn't a random theft. It was a message. A violation aimed directly at him. The outlaws mounted their horses, their movements swift and practiced. With a final mocking tip of his hat, Silas Blackwood spurred his horse and galloped out of town, his gang following close behind, leaving a cloud of dust, a dead sheriff, and the shattered piece of Jedediah stone in their wake. Jed stood motionless, and the heat of the forge forgotten the roar in his ears, louder than any hammer's strike. The ghosts he had tried to drown in sweat and fire were screaming now. Silas Blackwood hadn't just robbed a bank and killed a friend. He had reached into Jed's soul and stolen the last fragile pieces of his heart. Retirement was over. Anonymity was a luxury he could no longer afford. This was no longer about justice. It was a reckoning. The sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across redemption. The town undertaker had taken Gus's body, and a nervous quiet had fallen over the main street. The only sounds were the creak of a saloon sign in the evening breeze, and the low murmur of voices from the town hall where the council was holding an emergency meeting. Jed sat in the cooling darkness of his smithy. On the anvil before him lay his old gun belt. The leather was cracked and worn, the holster molded to the shape of the Colt Peacemaker that now rested beside it. He had cleaned and oiled the weapon with mechanical precision, his hands steady, but his mind was a maelstrom. For 3 years that gun had remained locked in a chest, a relic of a life he swore he had left behind. Now its cold metallic weight felt like an extension of his own hand. The locket, the image of Silas holding it smiling, was burned into his mind. Every clang of the hammer, every swing of his arm for the past 3 years had been an attempt to build a wall around his grief. Blackwood had torn it down in a single afternoon. He hadn't just taken the locket. He had taken the piece Jed had paid for in blood and sorrow. The doors to the smithy swung open, spilling the weak lantern light from the street onto the dirt floor. Mayor Thompson stood there, a portly, anxious man, flanked by 2 other council members. They looked at Jed, then at the gun on the anvil, and their expressions were a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Jedediah, the mayor began, his voice strained. We need your help. Gus is gone. We have no law here now. Those men. Jed didn't look up. He ran a thumb over the cold steel of the Colt's barrel. Get the territorial marshals, he said, his voice a low rasp. It's their jurisdiction. They're 2 days' ride from here, and that's if a wire gets through, one of the councilmen pleaded. By then, Blackwood will be in Mexico. You were a marshal. They say you were the best. You know these lands. You know how to track men like him. Jed's jaw tightened. The best. That's what they called him. The best at bringing in men dead or alive. The best at filling coffins and creating orphans. The weight of his old badge felt like a phantom limb, an ache for a power he had grown to loathe. He remembered the weight of it on his chest, a burden that had promised order, but delivered only graves. That life is over for me, he said, his voice flat. Please, Jed Mayor Thompson said, stepping forward. We'll pay you whatever you ask. The bank is offering a reward, $500. Jed finally looked up, his storm-gray eyes, fixing the mayor with a gaze so intense the man took an involuntary step back. This isn't about your money. He stood the chair, scraping against the floor. He picked up the gun belt and strapped it around his waist. The familiar weight was both a comfort and a curse. He slotted the peacemaker into its holster. The action was as natural to him as breathing. He took something of mine, Jed said, his voice quiet but carrying the finality of a death sentence. I'll get it back. A young man appeared in the doorway behind the mayor. He was barely 20, with a face full of earnest ambition and a deputy's badge pinned crookedly to his vest. Eli Vance. Gus had taken him on a few months back, trying to teach the boy that the law was more than just words in a book. Eli looked pale and shaken, but his eyes were wide with a fierce, naive determination. Marshal Stone. Eli said, his voice cracking slightly. Sheriff Miller. He was teaching me. I want to help. I have to. It's my duty. Jed looked the boy over. He saw the fire in him, the same fire he'd once had before it had been doused in blood. He saw a boy who believed in right and wrong in a world that was mostly shades of gray. This isn't a job for a deputy boy. It's a hunt. I can ride. I can shoot, Eli insisted, stepping forward. I know these hills. I won't be a burden. I owe it to Sheriff Miller. Jed was about to refuse to send the boy back to the safety of his office, but he paused. Blackwood had a gang. He was one man, and perhaps having a boy who still believed in the law beside him would serve as a reminder of what he was fighting for and what he must not become again. Get your horse, Jed said gruffly, and a spare canteen. We ride at first light. Eli's face lit up with a mixture of relief and solemn purpose. The council members mumbled their thanks, promising supplies, a horse, anything he needed. Jed ignored them. His focus was singular, a burning point of light in the darkness of his rage. He walked past them and stepped out into the night. He looked down the street toward the silent sheriff's office, where Gus's body had lain just hours before. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. It whispered through the alleys, sounding like the ghosts of forgotten men. Jed thought of the locket, of the two faces inside, and of the man who had dared to touch it. He was no longer a blacksmith. He was no longer a husband or a father. Tonight, he was what Silas Blackwood had made him, a hunter. And the trail was already growing cold. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange as Jed and Eli rode out of redemption. The town was still asleep, a collection of dark, silent shapes, huddled against the vast emptiness of the desert. A sea of cracked red earth stretched before them, where the sun baked the life from everything but the scorpions and the ghosts of forgotten men. Jed rode a sturdy bay, gelding his movements economical and sure, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He had shed the blacksmith's leather apron for the hardened, practical attire of the trail. Durable canvas trousers, a dark shirt, and a worn duster that fell to his boots. The colt at his hip was a constant, heavy reminder of his purpose. Eli, mounted on a nervous roan, was a stark contrast. He was a bundle of restless energy, his gear new, his canteen sloshing with every movement. He talked to fill the silence, a nervous stream of questions and observations. They rode southwest Marshall, toward the Dragoon Mountains, cut right through the Ocotillo Flats. "Think they're heading for the border?" Eli asked, his voice full of the eager certainty of youth. Jed didn't answer immediately. He dismounted, kneeling to examine the tracks left in the hard-packed earth. 5 horses shod, moving at a hard gallop. No surprises there. Maybe he said, his voice a low rumble, or maybe that's what he wants us to think. He stood and swung back into the saddle. Blackwood's not a common thief running for a border. The robbery killing Gus, the locket. It was all a performance. Men like that don't just run. They want an audience. Eli fell silent, chewing on Jed's words. He had seen the robbery as a brutal but simple act of crime. Jed saw it as something far more sinister, a chapter in a story he didn't yet understand. They rode for hours under the climbing sun. The silence of the desert was immense, broken only by the rhythmic plod of their horses' hooves and the sigh of the hot wind. Jed's mind was a landscape just as barren and harsh. Flashbacks sharp as shards of glass kept piercing his concentration. Not of Sarah and Lily, those memories were locked away with the stolen locket, but of his last day as a marshal. A shootout in a dusty canyon. Gun smoke thick as fog. The face of an outlaw, Marcus Kane, snarling as he went down, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that promised it wasn't over. Jed had stood over him, the smoking pistol in his hand, feeling not victory, but a profound emptiness. That was the day he unpinned his badge for good. Marshal Eli's voice broke through the memory. Over there. He pointed toward a thin plume of black smoke rising against the pale blue sky. It was miles away, a dark stain on the horizon. Jed's expression hardened. It wasn't a campfire. It was too thick, too angry. They urged their horses into a canter, the urgency, a silent shared understanding. An hour later, they crested a ridge and looked down on the source of the smoke. It was a small, smoldering homestead, a testament to some settler's broken dream. The cabin was a blackened skeleton, the corral fence shattered. The air smelled of ash and something metallic and sweet. The smell of death. They dismounted, guns drawn, and approached with caution. The place was deserted save for 2 bodies lying near the gutted remains of the cabin. A man and a woman shot and left where they fell. Jed's stomach tightened. This was Blackwood's work. Senseless, cruel, and without reason. Why, Eli whispered, his face pale, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by the stark horror of a boy seeing the true face of evil for the first time. They had nothing to steal. Jed didn't answer. He was kneeling not by the bodies, but by the scorched timber of the corral gate. Burned into the wood was a symbol, a brand. It was a circle with a jagged line like a lightning bolt cutting through it. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up Jed's spine. His breath hitched. He had seen that brand before, a long time ago. It was the mark of the Kane Gang, a vicious band of outlaws he had personally dismantled nearly a decade ago. A gang led by the man from his flashback. Marcus Kane. But that was impossible. He'd killed Marcus. He'd scattered the rest of the gang to the winds, sending most to prison or the gallows. They were ghosts, a closed chapter in his violent history. He traced the brand with his finger. It was fresh. This wasn't an old mark. It was a message. Silas Blackwood was resurrecting the past. His past. "It's a brand," Eli said, stating the obvious, trying to make sense of the scene. "For cattle, No, Jed said, his voice grim as he stood. It's for men. He looked around the homestead, his marshal's instincts kicking in, overriding the blacksmith's quiet despair. He saw it then. The tracks. Blackwood's gang had been here, but they hadn't ridden off together. The trail had split. 2 riders had gone south toward the mountains. 3 had cut east toward the barren plains. He's splitting his trail, Eli said, frustration in his voice, trying to make us choose. Jed stared at the 2 divergent paths, the sun beating down on his neck. Blackwood was playing a game. A cruel, elaborate game with rules only he understood. This burned-out farm, the brand, the split trail, was all part of the performance. He wasn't just running. He was leading Jed on a journey, forcing him to confront the bloody specters of his own past. He's not trying to make us choose. Boy, Jed said, his eyes fixed on the eastern trail. He's testing me. He wants to see if the old marshal still knows how to hunt. He swung back into his saddle, his decision made. The southern trail was the obvious choice, the one leading toward the border and safety. It was a decoy. The real trail, the one that led to answers, lay to the east, into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. It was the harder path, the one that led away from reason and deeper into the heart of Silas Blackwood's madness. "We go east," Jed declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. Eli hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting from the dead settlers to the ominous brand, then to the endless expanse of the plains. The clear lines of right and wrong he had lived by were blurring into a terrifying gray. He was no longer just helping a marshal track a killer. He was stepping into a story that had begun long before he was born, a story written in blood and fire. With a determined set of his jaw, he spurred his horse and followed Jed into the desolate emptiness. The eastward trail was a lesson in frustration. For 2 days, they pushed across a landscape that seemed actively hostile to life. The sun was a relentless tyrant, and the plains were a monotonous ocean of scorched grass and shimmering heat waves. Silas had chosen his ground well. The hard-baked earth held tracks for only a few yards before they vanished, forcing Jed to rely on subtle signs, a turned stone, a broken blade of grass, the distant flight of a startled bird. Eli's initial determination slowly eroded into a weary silence. The brutal reality of the hunt was setting in. There were no clear signposts, no heroic charges, only the endless, grueling work of tracking ghosts through a purgatory of dust and heat. "How do you do it?" Marshal Eli asked one evening as they made a cold camp chewing on hardtack. "How do you see a trail where there's nothing to see?" Jed stared into the vast, star-dusted darkness. "You don't look for the trail," he said, his voice low. "You think like the man who made it. You learn his habits, his fears, his pride. Blackwood's not afraid. He's proud. He's leaving just enough for me to follow. He wants to be followed." The next day they found proof. Hanging from the branch of a lone skeletal mesquite tree was a dead rattlesnake. Tied to its tail was a strip of silk torn from a woman's dress. It was a taunt, a grotesque marker left specifically for them. Jed felt a cold fury rise within him. Blackwood wasn't just a killer. He was a puppeteer, and Jed was his marionette dancing at the end of a long, bloody string. They followed the faint trail to a small, nearly deserted mining town called Sulphur Creek. It was a place clinging to life by a thread, its buildings leaning like tired old men. In the town's only saloon, Jed's questions were met with fear and suspicion. No one had seen a man matching Silas Blackwood's description. But as Jed was about to leave the saloon's aging proprietor, a man with fear in his eyes slipped him a folded piece of paper. "He left this for you," the man whispered, refusing to meet Jed's gaze. "Said a man with stormy eyes would come asking." Jed unfolded the paper. On it was a charcoal drawing surprisingly well executed. It was a sketch of a U.S. Marshal's badge, but with a crack running through the star. Beneath it, a single word, Diablo. Diablo Canyon, Jed muttered. It was a treacherous maze of red rock formations, 50 miles to the north, a place where Pazes got lost and outlaws vanished. It's a trap. Marshal Eli said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He's daring us to come to him. I know, Jed said, his voice tight. As they prepared to leave Sulphur Creek, Jed noticed Eli acting strangely. The boy was nervous, avoiding his gaze. His answers to Jed's questions clipped and evasive. Jed's instincts, honed by years of reading men, prickled with suspicion. Something was wrong. That night, as they camped in the rocky foothills leading to Diablo Canyon, Jed decided to force the issue. They sat by a small, smokeless fire, with the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. You're spooked, Eli, Jed said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. And it's not just Blackwood. Eli flinched. I'm fine, Marshal. Just tired. You've been jumpy since Sulphur Creek, Jed pressed. You went to the telegraph office while I was in the saloon. Who were you wiring? Eli's face went white. He opened his mouth to deny it, but the lie wouldn't form. His shoulders slumped in defeat. You weren't supposed to see that. See what Jed's voice was like stone. Eli's eyes filled with tears of guilt and fear. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small crumpled telegram. He handed it to Jed with a trembling hand. Jed read the message, his expression hardening with every word. It was a wire addressed to a rancher named Abernathy, near the town of Wilcox. The message was simple. He's heading north to Diablo Canyon. Tell SB the old wolf is walking into the trap. Jed looked up from the telegram, his gray eyes boring into the young deputy. The sense of betrayal was a sharp physical blow. Abernathy, Jed said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. I put him in business a decade ago. Testified for him when he was fighting for his land. He's not the man you knew. Marshal Eli choked out the story, spilling from him in a desperate torrent. My family. My pa took out a loan from him. The drought hit, we couldn't pay. Abernathy was going to take our farm. Then a few weeks ago, a man came to see me. He said he worked for Abernathy's silent partner. He said he knew I was a deputy. He offered me a deal. Blackwood, Jed finished for him, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Eli nodded, sobbing openly now. He said if I just reported on your movements, he'd see the debt forgiven. He swore no one would get hurt. He said it was just to keep you from causing more bloodshed in redemption, to get you to turn back before you got yourself killed. I believed him, I swear I did. I thought I was protecting you. And my family. Jed stared at the boy, a tempest of emotions warring within him. There was the hot white fury of betrayal. Blackwood hadn't just been a step ahead of them. He had been listening to their every move. But beneath the anger was a cold, weary pity. He saw not a traitor, but a terrified boy caught in an impossible situation, manipulated by a master. He saw himself decades ago trying to balance the law with the messy, desperate needs of people. He crumpled the telegram in his fist. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and Eli's ragged sobs. Jed could ride away now, leave the boy to his fate and continue the hunt alone. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But then he looked at Eli's tear-streaked face, at the shattered idealism in his eyes. He saw the ghost of the man he used to be. Leaving him behind would be no different than leaving a wounded man to the wolves. Get up, Jed said, his voice devoid of emotion. Eli looked at him, his eyes wide with fear, expecting a blow or a bullet. "I said get up." Jed repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You were a fool, boy. You let him use you. Now you're going to help me use him back." Eli stared, confusion warring with hope on his face. What? What do you mean?" "Blackwood thinks he's leading a tired old wolf into a trap," Jed said, tossing the crumpled telegram into the fire, where it flared and turned to ash. "He's about to find out this wolf still has teeth. You're going to send another wire to Abernathy, and you're going to tell Blackwood exactly what I want him to hear." The trap was no longer in Diablo Canyon. The trap was now theirs to set. And Eli Vance, the compromised deputy, was about to become Jed's most unwitting and valuable weapon. Under Jed's cold, meticulous direction, Eli sent a second telegram. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, a message crafted to appeal to Silas Blackwood's arrogance. It claimed that the old wolf was wounded and wary, turning south to lick his wounds and bring in the territorial marshals, abandoning the chase to Diablo Canyon. It suggested a new meeting point for Blackwood's men to regroup a series of box canyons south of Wilcox, known as the Devil's Jawbone. It was a perfect lie, designed to make Silas believe his psychological warfare had broken Jed's spirit. "He'll take the bait," Jed said as they rode hard for the Devil's Jawbone, bypassing Diablo Canyon entirely. A man like Blackwood can't resist the chance to see his enemy broken and running. Eli rode in a state of terrified obedience. The weight of his betrayal was a physical burden, but the sliver of hope Jed had offered him a chance at redemption was a powerful motivator. He was no longer a deputy of the law. He was an instrument of Jed's will. They reached the Devil's Jawbone a full day ahead of when Blackwood's men were expected. It was a desolate, formidable place, a maze of narrow passages and high red walls that baked in the sun. Jed chose their ground with the strategic eye of a seasoned general. They would wait in a narrow pass, a bottleneck, where superior numbers meant nothing against the element of surprise. The wait was agonizing. Hours stretched into a day. Jed remained perfectly still, perched on a ledge overlooking the canyon floor, a rifle resting in his hands. He was a creature of stone and patience. Eli, in contrast, was a nervous wreck, starting at every sound, every shadow. "What if they don't come?" Eli whispered, his throat dry. "They'll come," Jed replied, without taking his eyes off the canyon. And they did. Late in the afternoon, 3 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, moving with a casual confidence that spoke of their certainty. Jed watched them, his heart a slow, steady drum. He let them ride deep into the bottleneck, right below their position. "Now," Jed said. He fired. The shot echoed like a cannon blast in the enclosed space. One of the riders cried out and tumbled from his horse. Before the other 2 could react, Jed had levered another round into the chamber. Eli, his fear momentarily forgotten in a surge of adrenaline, fired as well. His shot went wide, kicking up dust, but it served its purpose. The outlaws were pinned down, caught in a deadly crossfire. The gunfight was short and brutal. Trapped and exposed, Blackwood's men had no chance. One tried to make a break for it and was cut down by Jed's unerring aim. The third, the one Jed had wounded first, threw his pistol down in surrender. They brought the captured outlaw back to their camp. He was a sullen, hard-faced man with a bullet in his leg. Jed tended to the wound with a detached efficiency, then began his interrogation. The man was defiant, at first spitting curses. Jed didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply looked at the man with his stormy, unblinking eyes. "Silas played you for a fool," Jed said quietly. "He sent you here to die while he went somewhere else. He's not coming for you." The outlaw's bravado began to crack. Jed pressed his advantage. He has something that belongs to me. A silver locket. Tell me where he is, and I'll see that a doctor looks at that leg before it goes rotten. Stay silent, and I'll leave you here for the coyotes. Your choice." The man's will broke. The church, he gasped, his face slick with sweat. The old mission church at the edge of Diablo Canyon. He's waiting for you there. Said he had to finish it where it all began. Jed's blood ran cold. Where it all began. The words meant nothing to him, but they carried a weight of ominous purpose. He exchanged a look with Eli. The real trap hadn't been in the canyon. It had been here. A diversion to split up his gang and ensure Jed came to the final confrontation alone. "He's alone," Jed asked. "As far as I know," the outlaw groaned. He said this last part was personal. Jed tied the man securely, leaving him with water and a promise that a lawman would be back for him. Then he turned to Eli. "This is it, boy. This is where it ends." They rode north toward Diablo Canyon, a sense of grim finality settling over them. As they drew closer, the sky to the west began to darken, the clouds churning into a bruised, angry wall. A storm was coming. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, kicking up dust that stung their eyes and coated their throats. By the time they reached the clifftop overlooking the abandoned mission, the storm was on the verge of breaking. The church stood silhouetted against the swirling ochre sky, a skeletal ruin at the edge of the world. Its roof had partially collapsed, and the wind moaned through its empty window frames like a chorus of lost souls. It was a place where faith and law had died, leaving only a raw human struggle. "You stay here," Jed commanded Eli, his voice nearly lost in the rising shriek of the wind. "This is between him and me." Eli opened his mouth to protest, but the look on Jed's face silenced him. This was more than a hunt now. It was a pilgrimage into Jed's past, and he had to walk the final steps alone. Jed dismounted and drew his peacemaker. He walked toward the crumbling church, the wind tearing at his duster, the dust swirling around him like angry spirits. The world was reduced to the groaning of the old building and the howling of the storm. He stepped through the broken doors into the church's nave. Dust and debris littered the floor. Broken pews lay like fallen soldiers. At the far end, standing before the ruined altar, was Silas Blackwood. He was unmasked, his fine black coat dusted with grime, his charismatic smile as unnerving as ever. And in his hand, swinging gently from its chain, was the silver locket. "I knew you would come." Marshal Silas said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "A man can never truly run from his own history, can he?" "Give me the locket, Blackwood," Jed said, his pistol leveled. "This ends now." Silas laughed, a sound that was both charming and utterly insane. "Oh, it ended a long time ago, Jedediah. 10 years ago, to be precise. In a dusty canyon not 5 miles from here. Does the name Marcus Kane mean anything to you?" Jed froze. The name from his flashbacks. The outlaw he had killed. The brand. It all slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. "He was my brother Silas," said, his smile vanishing, replaced by a look of pure distilled hatred. "My older brother. You killed him. You shot him down and left him in the dirt. A legally justified kill, I believe the report said. But justice is a story we tell children. Out here there is only the will of the man holding the gun. You took my brother. You orphaned me. You sent me down this path." The storm broke in its full fury. Dust exploded through the windows, obscuring everything in a blinding, choking cloud. The old church groaned, its timbers screaming in protest as the wind hammered against it. "Everything," Silas's voice echoed through the maelstrom. "Every robbery, every man I've killed, it was all for you. A performance just like you suspected. I was unmaking your legacy, Jedediah, tearing down every good deed, turning every victory to ash. And this? He held up the locket. This was the final perfect touch. To take from you the very thing that drove you to quit the memory of the family you failed to protect. A section of the roof collapsed, showering them with debris. The world became a chaotic nightmare of howling wind, crashing timber, and swirling dust. Through the haze, Jed saw Silas lunge not with a gun, but with a knife. The fight was no longer a standoff. It was a primal, brutal struggle for survival. Jed fired, but the shot went wild in the blinding dust. Silas was on him, the knife slashing. Jed parried with his gun arm, the blade slicing through his duster. They crashed against a crumbling wall, a desperate, grunting battle of pure strength. This was what Silas wanted. Not a clean gunshot, but a raw hand-to-hand fight. To drag the legendary marshal down into the dirt to make him an animal. Jed slammed his fist into Silas's face, the impact jarring his arm to the shoulder. Silas staggered back, a cruel grin on his face, blood trickling from his lip. "There he is," Silas hissed. The man beneath the badge. The killer. He came at Jed again. They grappled, slipping on the debris-strewn floor, their conflict a microcosm of the raging storm around them. A massive gust of wind tore a stained-glass window from its frame, sending shards flying. The building was tearing itself apart. Jed wrestled the knife from Silas's grip, but lost his own pistol in the struggle. They were equals now, two men fueled by a decade of rage and grief. As they fought, a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm. It was Eli, his face a mask of terror and resolve. He held his pistol, but in the swirling chaos, he couldn't get a clear shot. Silas saw him. "Choose, boy," he screamed over the wind. "The law that failed you, or the man who understands your debt, who do you stand with?" Eli hesitated, his gun wavering. For a heart-stopping moment, Jed thought the boy would break. But then Eli's gaze met Jed's, and in that instant, a choice was made. Eli fired not at Jed, but at the heavy bell rope hanging near the altar. The shot frayed the old rope. With a groaning crack, the massive bronze bell above them tore loose from its rotten timbers. Silas looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, just as tons of metal and wood came crashing down. Jed threw himself backward, rolling clear. Silas was a fraction of a second too slow. The wreckage slammed down, pinning him, his leg crushed beneath a massive beam. He lay there gasping, defeated, not by a bullet, but by the crumbling symbol of a forgotten faith. The storm began to recede as quickly as it had come, its fury spent. Dust settled. The howling wind softened to a mournful whisper. Jed rose, bruised and bleeding, and walked over to where Silas lay trapped. The outlaw looked up at him, his face a mask of pain and hatred. "Finish it, Marshal," he spat. "Become the monster I always knew you were." Jed looked down at the man who had destroyed his peace, who had been the architect of his pain. His hand hovered over the pistol he'd retrieved from the floor. Vengeance was a simple, satisfying pull of a trigger away. He could end the cycle of Cain here and now. He could honor his friend Gus. But as he looked at Silas, he didn't see a monster. He saw an orphan, a boy twisted by grief and a thirst for revenge, not unlike the man he himself had almost become. Killing him would not bring back Sarah or Lily. It would not heal his soul. It would only prove Silas right. Slowly, Jed holstered his pistol. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The killing ends with me." He turned to Eli, who stood watching, his face streaked with dust and tears. "Get the ropes from my saddle. We're taking him in." He had made his choice. He would uphold the law one last time, not because it was perfect, but because it was better than the abyss of personal vengeance. He would not break the cycle. He would transcend it. The dust settled in the ruined church, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the retreating storm clouds, illuminating the scene of reckoning. Silas Blackwood lay pinned and defeated, his grand performance ending not with a bang, but with the groaning timbre of a fallen bell. Jed stood over him, not as an executioner, but as a lawman, a title he thought he'd shed forever. Eli, his face a mixture of awe and relief, quickly returned with the ropes. Together they worked to free Silas, a grim and difficult task. Silas cursed them, his words laced with the same poetic venom he'd used all along, but the fire in his eyes was dying, replaced by the cold reality of his capture. Once he was free, his leg crudely splinted, Jed bound his hands securely. Silas looked up at him, a flicker of disbelief in his pain-filled eyes. "You're a fool, Stone. You should have killed me. My story will become a legend. Yours will be forgotten." "Maybe," Jed said, pulling the final knot tight. "But I'll be able to live with mine." He turned Silas over to Eli. "Take him back to Redemption. Wire the territorial marshals in Tucson. Tell them Jedediah Stone has a prisoner for them." Eli nodded, his youthful face now etched with a maturity that hadn't been there days before. "Marshal, about what I did, I'm so sorry." Jed placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. The anger he'd felt was gone, washed away in the storm. "You made a mistake, Eli. A bad one. But in the end, you chose your side. You chose the law. That's a start. Now go on. Do your duty." The young deputy led Silas away, leaving Jed alone in the wreckage. He scanned the debris until he saw the silver locket lying half buried in the dust near the altar. He picked it up, his calloused fingers tracing its familiar engravings. He clicked it open. The tiny, perfect faces of Sarah and Lily looked up at him, their painted smiles untouched by the violence that had surrounded them. A profound, aching relief washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He held the locket to his chest, a silent prayer of thanks on his lips. The ride back to Redemption was quiet. Jed rode slowly, letting the peace of the desert seep back into his bones. The world looked different now, the colors sharper, the air cleaner. He was no longer a man running from his past, but a man who had faced it and survived. When he arrived, the town was already buzzing with the news. Eli had brought Silas in, and the outlaw was now locked in the same cell his gang had once tried to empty. The townsfolk looked at Jed with a new respect, a quiet reverence. He was no longer just the blacksmith. He was the marshal who had returned from the wilderness to deliver them from evil. Jed ignored the praise. He went first to the undertaker's office to pay his respects to Gus Miller, standing for a long moment by his old friend's coffin. Then he walked to the small, windswept cemetery on the edge of town. Two simple wooden headstones stood side by side under a lonely cottonwood tree. Sarah Stone, beloved wife; Lily Stone, beloved daughter. He knelt in the dirt before them, the locket warm in his hand. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Lily, I got it back. I almost lost myself doing it. Became the man I swore I'd never be again. But I didn't. I hope you'd be proud." He stayed there until the sun began to dip below the horizon, talking to them, unburdening a decade of grief and guilt. That evening, he returned to his smithy. The forge was cold, the anvil silent. From the bottom of an old wooden chest, he retrieved a small, tarnished object, his U.S. Marshal's badge. He looked at the silver star, a symbol of a life that had brought him as much pain as purpose. It represented justice, but it also represented the violence that had taken him from his family, the violence he had almost succumbed to in that church. With a final resolute breath, he lit the forge. The bellows breathed life into the coals, and soon they glowed with a furious heat. He took the badge in a pair of tongs and thrust it into the heart of the fire. He watched as the silver heated softened and lost its shape. The proud star melting into a formless, glowing teardrop. He laid the molten silver on his anvil. He picked up his hammer, not the heavy sledge he used for horseshoes, but a smaller, more delicate tool. He began to shape the metal. The clang of the hammer was different now. It was not the sound of drowning out ghosts, but the sound of creation. He was not forging a weapon or a tool of the law. He hammered the silver with a patient, loving hand, folding and shaping it, his mind clear as heart, at peace. He worked through the night. As the first light of dawn crept into the smithy, he plunged the finished piece into a bucket of water. A hiss of steam rose, and when he pulled it out, it shone brightly in the pale light. It was no longer a badge of office, a symbol of violence. It was a simple, elegant cross. He saddled his horse and rode back to the cemetery. The morning was cool and quiet. He knelt again at the graves of his wife and daughter. With great care, he gently pressed the silver cross into the weathered wood of their shared headstone, where it caught the morning sun and glittered like a captured star. He had honored their memory not with vengeance, but with the quiet strength of a man who had finally come home. He stood, his hand resting on the headstone, and looked out at the sunrise painting the desert in strokes of gold and rose. The ghosts were silent. The hunt was over. Jedediah Stone was no longer a marshal, no longer a hunter haunted by his past. He was a blacksmith, a man at peace standing in the quiet light of a new day.